Good evening, everybody. This is the recap. I will be addressing what we discussed last night at Bible study. We chose to tackle the topic of transgenderism because that is a pretty hot button topic right now in our country with what's going on in Charlotte, North Carolina, and with Target. And you may think, well, that doesn't sound very close to home. Do I have to be worried about this? And the reality is it goes even beyond this because as of, I believe, yesterday, there was an article about a town about 40 minutes away from here that was preparing the school to have a fourth grader who was transitioning from a male to a female. So clearly this is an important topic. Clearly it's something we need to address from a biblical worldview to understand what God says on the topic and what will be most glorifying to Him. And we have to address this so that we can help our children understand the world they're living in, how they can address these things. And the reality is that there are going to be times that this might seem awkward. It might seem awkward to have these conversations with our children or with our friends and family, especially if we have friends and family who struggle with this. And so we need to be mindful. We need to be prepared. And it may be awkward, but I would rather a Christian be active and awkward than have a Christian be lazy. But we shouldn't be ignorant. We should be mindful. We should be thoughtful. We should be seeking the scriptures daily to see what God has to say. Be like the Bereans. And so we started off and we talked about the reality of the issue. We talked about throughout the night about God creating people as they are, and they have a God-designed role and purpose for who they are, and that role and that purpose should not be mutilated. It should not be confused. So many of these kids who are thinking that they are the wrong gender and the wrong body is because they're being fed information that is lies. And so we have to speak the truth, but we speak the truth in love. And that's why I showed a clip, or I showed a highlight of clips about 10 minutes long of a Christian teacher on a show called the Dr. Drew Show. And they brought in a panel of people to talk about transgenderism, specifically in related to Bruce Jenner, who has now gone and called himself Caitlyn Jenner, who's changed his body, changed his hormones. I believe he's received hormone therapy, changed his birth certificate, so that in a way, Bruce Jenner never exists now. He never did. He never will. But that's not true. That's a lie. And one of the most telling things I ever saw was when he sat down with his ex-wife and told her that he changed his birth certificate. And she got this look like, really? You did that? It's almost as if you didn't exist now. Bruce never existed. I never was married. And for her, it seemed heartbreaking. And what a lot of people don't realize when they go and they say, well, just let people feel how they want to feel, is that these issues affect so many more people than just that one individual who's confused about why he or she does not feel right in their body. But when we address things from a biblical perspective and we go to what the Word of God says, here's one of the things we notice. There are going to be times where we don't feel right. We don't agree with God. But that doesn't change the reality. It doesn't change the reality that because God has spoken, there is a best way, a prescribed way. And to choose any other way is to choose something that is not beneficial, that is harmful. And we need to have this perspective that when people go and they start a destructive lifestyle, it is harmful to them and to others, whether they understand that now or whether they ever personally experience that pain. And The reality is most in the transgender community do experience this pain. The transgender community, this group of individuals who are confused about who they are and who are willing to go and change their birth certificate, even mutilate and harm their body. The reality is that the suicide rate is one of the highest among this section of people. More than any other group in history, this group of people, because they have a mental condition that tells them there's something wrong. And instead of getting help, people feed into the delusion. And here's the scary thing. And it's something that a lot of the people who support what Bruce Jenner has done and others have done, they don't tell you, is that the suicide rate does not go down after they go and get surgery or hormones or anything else. The suicide rate does not go down. Why? Because there's a mental condition. And when somebody is struggling because of sin, because of confusion, we don't feed into that. As one of the people last night pointed out, when there's an alcoholic who is killing their liver, destroying their family, you don't go to them and tell them, well, if you feel like you should be drinking this, then keep drinking it. If you feel that it's okay for you to ruin your liver, then do it. If it makes you feel good, then it's right. No. And that's what the clips of Dr. James White, the man who went on the Dr. Drew show, was about. He was addressing the reality that life is not all about what makes me feel good. It's what is good. And he pointed out to them that there is a set standard of what God has said, and because God has spoken, we are to seek that standard. And not everybody on the panel agreed with him. Of course, it was a very mixed panel. Many people who probably don't believe in God, or if they do, they've shifted and twisted what they mean by that so that God fits into their desires instead of their desires fitting into God's will. And he kept drawing them back to this. Because God has spoken, there is an answer. Now look, when we tell people there's an answer, that's not hateful. When we tell people that you may not understand this, but all you're doing is mutilating your body, and it is impossible to change your gender. God made you male or He made you female. You cannot change that. You can hurt yourself, but that will never make you feel better. And what Dr. White did so well is he pointed out to the rest of the panel that the men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, that what they did not make them feel good. It did not make them happy. They were not happy, but they were doing what was right, what was good. And as Christians, we have to speak up on these issues, because that is what is right, and that is what is good, and that is what is glorifying to God, and ultimately, that is what is going to help people the most. And as he shared this truth with these people, they had a clear understanding. He didn't hate them. He wasn't going to be mean to them. He was not for a second going to feed into the lies that they had been told and that they believed. But they understood when they saw him that he loved them. He was never going to agree. And that's how we have to be. When we speak to our friends, our family, those who are struggling, we speak to them the truth. That God says there's a better way, that He created you this way, it has a purpose, and it's good. That your maleness is a good thing, your femaleness is a good thing, and it should not be messed with. That when you take that away, you are harming yourself. And we need to be clear with them that that's what's happening. They're mutilating their bodies, they're harming themselves. Those who are agreeing with them are feeding into a mental delusion that needs help, not agreement. Now that's not politically correct. It's just not. But I would much rather us be biblically correct than politically correct. Politically correct does no good for no one. But biblically correct does so much good for so many people. And that's what Scripture teaches us again and again. That as we preach the word and as we live as God would have us live, that people will see that and their eyes will be open to God's truth and they will finally come to know Him as He is. And you may not be comfortable doing this yet, but the reality is there are some things. One of the guys last night said this is a wonderful, wonderful statement. There are some things that are black and white in this kindergarten country we live in. And yes, you might make some people upset. You might make some people cry. But the reality is you will do them more damage and more harm, not only in this life, but for eternity, if you don't speak the truth now. And one of the ladies that was here last night, she made this comment. Well, if everyone can just identify as whatever they want, can I identify as a non-sinner? And what it did is it caused all of us to stop and say, I think that's what's happening. When all these people begin to identify as something that God has said is sin, and identified in a way that goes against how God created them, that's what they're doing. When people feed into the delusion, that's what they're doing. They're saying, I identify this as good. Even if God said it's sin, I identify this as good. So God, I say I am not a sinner. But God says all have fallen short of the glory of God. There is no one who does good. No, not one. This is why we need Jesus Christ. This is why we need to preach the gospel to everyone we encounter. Because we are not good. We need the goodness and the righteousness of Christ to cover us, to transform us, and to make us good. Brothers and sisters, this topic is an important topic. I do want to draw attention to one more thing. We talked a lot last night about the reality of this community of people. And I struggle calling the transgender community a community because it's a community identified by sin. And we can do that, but I don't want to encourage them to think of themselves that way. To be a people only focused on that one aspect of sin. And so we address that primarily. How can we speak to this group of people? How can we help them? How can we love them? And I was listening to a show, and I'll go ahead and post a lot of what we talked about in the descriptions below. But a show that was discussing the reality that our brains are just not fully developed. Certain aspects of our brains are not fully developed until we're 17 or until we're 25. Different aspects can go as far as 25. And the reality is that this school, about 45 minutes away from where we live, has a fourth grader. A fourth grader. And no one in the scientific community believes that fourth grader's brain is fully developed right now. So that it can process all of the actions and all of the potential future ramifications of their actions now. So if this child goes through a transition, which you can't transition, and I that's not hateful to say. You cannot change yourself from a male to a female. All you can do is mess up your body. So when they do this harm to their body through hormones and through surgery, here's the reality. They don't know what they're going to feel like in 10 years, in 12 years. They may look back on this as a terrible decision because right now they're confused and they're not able to fully process these things. And so we have to speak, because the reality is we have to speak out for these kids too. Because someone is feeding in to their confusion and convincing them of this thing. There's a word for that. It's child abuse. It is abusive to children. Abusive to children. To convince them that they are something that God says they are not. I want to end with this. I do want to make this note. Next week we're going to continue the discussion. We're going to continue in terms of how this can continue to snowball in our country, how we should be prepared for what might come out of this, how should Christians react to the transgender confused people, let me just say gender confused. That's better than transgender. The gender confused people using bathrooms, especially in our schools, because that will happen. It's happening in this town I mentioned. And should we boycott places that do this? And what are the other dangers that the culture around us does not see right now? What are the other dangers that might come out of this movement? And we're going to address all of that next week in some detail. But I want to leave with this note. One of the people who was here last night was making the comment that for her, she saw the other sexual issues in our culture as being of a different caliber. And if people just want to live a certain way, let's let them live a certain way with marriage. And she's beginning to realize, she said, as she encountered this, there was something about it that God just made it clear to her that she knew this was not right. This was not what God wanted for these people. And it's made her realize that all of these things are tied together. And that's true. Morality and sin is a thing that is tied together. And if we cave on one issue, we are more likely to cave on another issue down the road. If we feed into some people's delusions, we're more likely to feed into others. And we need to be willing to take a stand even now for Christ. So I want to thank everyone who came last night, Monday night, for the Bible study. And my prayer is that as many of you as are able would come next Monday night. We need to address this topic, and we need to know how to. We can't speak out of anger. We can't speak in hatred. We can't speak with violence in our hearts. We need to speak with love and with truth. Thank you, everybody. Have a blessed night.